Hey guys, welcome to this UI video for beginners but in depth, where we will be looking at a few things which are going to be very useful for you to create your very own user interfaces. In this video, we will look at three big parts. Big parts. The first one is just describing two UI types, overlay and web-like. In the second part of the video, we will look at how you can integrate the UI in your game based on the type and based on your needs. And last, we will focus on the UI building tools and tips and things you can implement to basically make the super complex UI of your dreams true. Just to make sure that I'm not misleading you, this video, the content of this video is fully created by me, which means that I may be using concepts or terms which actually are not used by anyone else. If they are, it's a lucky coincidence, I guess, because that's just the most intuitive way I went to find those. But basically, if you look for overlay UI or web-like UIs, you might not find the same things because I've been just improvising somehow. So first, before anything, I would like to make the difference between what is an overlay user interface and a web-like user interface. So here, we have an example of a game, which is Rim World, where it is a very obvious overlay user interface, right? So here, the main feature of the game is obviously this world and the camera moving in the world. And the user interface is surrounding all this with a simple overlay on all four sides. So this is a very common UI you will find on many games where the main feature of the game is something that will take the vast majority of your screen. Okay, so that's it for this kind of UI. There's another kind of UI that I want to show you, and this is the web-like UI. Here we have another game, which is Magic Research. Magic Research is what I would call a web-like user interface for a game. The entire screen is actually filled with what could be understood as a big web page. Everything is organized, segmented, and there is no space left for the camera to be watching and doing things, right? So this is what you will be using when the main content of the game is actually the user interface itself. On the channel, I've been mostly making games with web-like user interface, like this one. But it's actually very easy to make overlay user interfaces when you know how to make those web-like user interfaces. Overlays are just very simple compared to that. There is a third thing I want to show you, which is the nesting sort of worlds and user interfaces. The very last thing I want to show you as an introduction is the concept of embedded viewports within the user interface. So here you have a very classic action RPG game, and what happens is that just like in RimWorld, we have the main camera, the main game happening in the entirety of the screen. Then we have the overlay right, in front, which is sticked on the front, but there's something quite specific to this game, and actually a lot of games, but which RimWorld doesn't have. It is this little minimap here. As you can see, when you move in the world, the minimap is also moving, right? So in a sense, the minimap here is a world in its own, but we are choosing to display it in this little space on the screen, right? So at some point, we need to be able to say what space of the screen is going to be used for what purpose. This is where the concepts of different types of UI integration comes into place. So here I noticed and listed a few ways to implement interface within your game. So first, we have the UI elements within the world. So here I did a little example, even though the color is super wrong, I don't know why it's doing that, but here, if we take RimWorld, you can see that next to a pound, we do have the name of the pound as well as the health bar showing. Those part of the user interface are connected or sticked with the pound itself. So what this means is that when you move the camera, the pound is moving with the camera moving, and the interface connected to that pound is actually sticking next to the pound. It's not in front, like an overlay, right? So this is the common thing that you might find in some action RPG if you want those health bars and stuff. And basically, it's just as simple as adding the user interface nodes within the game and the world, right? You have your node of the pound node with the rigid body, the collider maybe, the sprite, and you just add the label in there and the progress bar in there as well. The second way to integrate user interface within your game is by using an overlay. Basically, Godot uses a system of canvas layers to draw things. And we will see later on during the examples that if you want your user interface to be in front of the game, basically, and sticking to some space on the screens, you actually have to put those elements in another canvas layer, which will be, well, which will not be observed by the camera. The third way to integrate user interface is this example of the minimap that I was showing you. Basically, what you want to do in those kind of situations, with Godot, you want to use the sub viewport container. The viewport is what contains your game, basically. It's above the canvas layers, I believe. But the point is that what you're doing is that you're actually creating a different rendering space that you defined within the user interface. Okay, so this can be part of a WebLite user interface or an overlay. Here it's obviously part of the overlay, right? The circle containing the map is within the overlay of the game. But within that overlay, you can embed a part of your game, a world that will be here in that situation, the minimap. So this is the last way to integrate user interface in the big ways. Then we have the UI building tools. So here I will just explain a little bit what we have, and then we will jump to the examples. In my opinion, if you want to make UI with Godot, there are two main pillars that you have to understand and master. The first one is anchors, and the second one is containers. Anchors are the main positioning tool for UI building. This is what you will use to position one individual element. As I've noted there, it's very important to remember that the position that's created with the anchor is always considered with the most direct parent of the node. Okay? It can be used in many different ways to either position one thing in the overlay, right? So for example, if you take this minimap thing, you would have an anchor that puts your element at the top right, and it's inverted, but right. But you can also have anchors that will allow you later on within the containers to position things more precisely. Yes, that was folded, but anyway, we have expanding anchors, which are very important to understand. You have the basic anchors that will position an object, but you will also have the expanding or stretching anchors that will take an object and stretch it based on the space available within the parent, right? So here I've put a simple example. It is very common to use the anchor expanding both vertically and horizontally to have any node take the entire space of its parent. The next big pillar to build UI is containers. Containers takes a little bit of time to be apprehended and understood fully because there's just so much about those that it will take some time. So you will have to practice, but it's actually very, very, very useful. What is very important to note is that containers have two different purposes which can oppose themselves. So what I mean there is that the main use of containers is to have the container expanding based on its content. The size of the container is based on its content. So this is the first line. Containers will expand based on the size of their children. But that's not just what they do. Containers can also be used to expand the children based on the size available. Understand here the size of the container. So these are two very different behaviors, but you use the same tool to do that. Because here we have this very simple thing. The more children you put in the container, the more the container will stretch to get everything to fit in. But you can basically set the children of the container to say, I want to expand in the space available. Here I put a note which says that it's actually contains children which define whether or not they need to expand. This is individual to each child, right? It's not all the children expand. No, it's this one expand and not this one, or this one expands and this one expands less. You can do that. But ultimately, even though it is the children saying I want to expand, it is the container which will decide what space will be allocated to what child. So that is an important other aspects of containers, they control the size of their children. Children say what they need. Containers give those children that space. Then we have different types of containers. So here I just listed the most common one, but there are others, right, which allows you to make more complicated thing, but which can be useful. And here I've also put a small note to remind people that even though containers can expand based on their content, which can be a problem when you have lists and stuff, you can actually use the scroll container to set a space that you want to take, and then inside that scroll container you just have your over expanding list or container, I guess, that will take more space, and it will not get out of the bounds that you want it to be in. Instead, you will simply be able to scroll through it. All right, so that's enough theorizing for now. Let's go within Godot to see exactly what I'm talking about. Here I will be using the project that I used to make the interactive map in another video. So on this project here, just showing you, there is an actual example of what it looks like to have the world being embedded within a web-like user interface or overlay interface, doesn't matter, but you have a world embedded within the user interface and not a user interface shown on top of the world. So if you want to see how this was created, you can go in this video interactive map. You will see exactly how I did this, but it's not the point of what I want to show you right now. First, I want to show you how to integrate an overlay user interface, right? So let's look at this thing. Just want to remind you that this blue rectangle there, it is the base viewport of your application when there is no camera. When there is a camera, the actual view that you get is actually this pink rectangle now. So even though this is the base viewport, what we see is that. So let's imagine that we have a game here, and let's just add a, why is it on the other screen? Let's add a control node that will be the user interface, right? Let's position this on our main blue rectangle and add a simple, actually I want a panel. Let's have a panel that will be sticked on the top with 80 pixels, right? So here, if I watch this scene, I do have this rectangle at the top, right? That's the user interface. But now if I do add the world there, as you can see, since the camera is moving, the user interface is also moving. So this is very bad. We do want the user interface to stick to where it's supposed to be, no matter where the camera is. So this is where the overlay integration falls into place. You actually create a second canvas layer within your game, which will be the overlay user interface, right? So you just drag your user interface in this new canvas layer. And now, no matter where the camera is, you will have your user interface staying at the same place. There is no script moving the camera, so I'm not going to move the camera above the map, but You get the point, right? It's very easy. Now that we know how to implement a user interface like this, we will talk about building the user interface. And this is the funniest part, if you like doing that. Actually, many people hate building user interface. So I guess I'm lucky to like it. So anyway, let's have this user interface here and save it in a branch, which will be another folder. All right, back to RimWorld. Let's see what user interface we have here and how we reproduce this thing. Here we have this resource list on the side, which is a list of things being added indefinitely. So this is just a container that receives a list of elements, and they all stack on top of each other, and the container expands as the content expands. At the bottom, we have a list of buttons, which are expanding to take the entire screen space. Then we have a few information on the sides. Here we have little labels which updates based on the cursor. On the right we have calendar, temperature, things like this, as well as a set of buttons. We have a line of buttons for the time and a grid of filter buttons. All this is anchored to the right. And last we have this pound list at the top, which is anchored at the top. All right, so we will see how we can reproduce this, but first let's talk about containers. Here, if we go in the control nodes, we have the container categories, and here we have all the very interesting containers. So as I said, the purpose of a container is to get its space based on the children, right? And that's actually can be very useful to build things. Here, for example, we have the box containers, vertical and horizontal. What they do is they will just organize their children either vertically or horizontally, one next to the other. And every time you add a child, the box will expand to fit the child. Then, another one which is interesting is the scroll container. The scroll container, when getting out of the bounds of the container itself, will create a scrolling. That's super interesting. The margin container is very interesting because if you use Unity, you know that you can position objects in Unity by saying, I want the position of this object to be 10 pixels from the left, right? So you actually have the margins outside of your object. This is something that I had a lot of trouble to reproduce in Godot, because Godot doesn't have this thing as saying that if I want to position an object, I can say that I want X or Y distance for this or that side, right? Instead, we have the margin container, which is an entire object which allows us to create some space on the sides and then add the children within that. The panel container, interesting to note, is basically a panel, but that will resize based on its content, right? Sometimes, for a very long time actually, I was using vertical or horizontal box containers and trying to add panels, and it was a nightmare to do until I realized I actually just had to use the panel container, and I felt stupid. Actually, I was just unaware of this thing, so not stupid. Anyway, containers can be used to organize your screen, right? So we will look at this thing here. We will reproduce slowly each element of this game, okay? We will begin by creating a list of buttons at the bottom of the screen, okay? So here we have the user interface, and we use the anchors, the full rect anchor, to basically say I want to take the entire space available by stretching horizontally and vertically. Now, I want to add those buttons. So they are aligned horizontally. So in order to make this, I will need a horizontal box container to have those buttons lining up. So here I create a simple page box, which at the moment I will anchor it bottom and wide. In this box, I will add buttons, right? And at the moment, we have nothing because the container is waiting for the buttons to tell, for the children to tell what size they need. So we have two ways, okay, to go with the sizing. The first one is to have specific size like this, but because we have a container, the only thing we can say is give a minimum size. Okay, so here I'm just gonna give a minimum height of the I don't know, 40 pixels seems right, and then I will just fill the button with button text. So the text within the button is updating the minimum size of the button itself, and that's pretty much it. So here I created one button. Now let's say that I create more buttons. They will line up properly at the bottom, just like the H box is supposed to do. However, if we do look at this one particularly, we want the buttons to take the entire space. So in order to achieve this, we have to set the buttons, which are the children of the container, to specify that they want to take that space available here. In order to set a child from a container, however you want it to behave, you will have to go in the layout category in the control properties, and you have container sizing. There you can choose the anchors for the contents, but the most important, you can choose if you want an element to expand. So as you can see, here the button is taking all that space available here, and it stretches to get that space. Now, we actually want all the 5 buttons to be set the same way. And what the container does in that kind of situation is it will share evenly the space between the children needing space. There's a stretch ratio that you can tinker with if you need buttons to be bigger than others, right? That's just something you might want to know. And now there's one last thing we want to deal with. it is this little space in between the buttons. This comes from some containers, especially HBox and BBox. Maybe others, maybe that's just the two, I don't know. Anyway, they have a theme in the container, sorry. They have a theme constant, which is the separation between each and every object. So here, for example, there's a base spacing that you can remove by overriding the separation and having 0 or 1 or whatever you want. So anyway, I will just leave 1 because it leaves some separation between the button, and that's not that bad. All right. So here we have the buttons at the bottom of the screen. Now, I want to bring your attention to something in particular. Here, we have other things on the UI. On the bottom right corner, and here, this resource list, at some point, it needs to end because it could go on and on and on and on and go off screen, right? How do we actually set those objects here to not be anchored on top of the buttons and to be above the buttons? So it takes practice, I guess, and yes, it takes practice to actually be able to view those boxes and how they get together. So here, basically what I see is one huge box here, which takes the entirety of the screen, and a little box at the bottom, which takes the buttons. And those two, I see them as being within a vertical box, right? Where we have the buttons at the bottom of the screen. And here we have a big box, which is saying, give me all the space you have. So in Godot, this comes in the form of having here a vertical box that takes the entire screen, okay? And within there, we have this little button thing, right? Which is at the bottom. But we also have another box, which is right there. And as I said, it expands, right? So it takes the entire screen. Okay. So now, if I do add something anchored at the bottom right corner, it will be anchored right above the buttons. I mean, yes, you get what I mean, not overlapping. All right. The next thing we will be doing is I will just add a small margin to the main view, because if we just create things right now, it will be sticked to the borders and it will almost be touching the border of the screen. And that's a little bit weird, right? So I will create a margin container within this main area. Here we will have the buttons, and this will be the VBox container, that's the name. Well, so anyway, in there, I will add a margin, which I will anchor to take the entire space. And in margins, you go in theme, overrides, and I will add 8 pixels on each side. Okay? So now that I have this, I can add other objects within there. So we need, let's start with those resources here. So we will create a list that will allow us to display some resources vertically. So I'm gonna add a vertical box like this. And in fact, let me see. I will just invert the positioning of the margin and the main area. So here, the margin will be above the main area, and it will be set to expand, just like the main area used to, right? So here, this main area now can't expand, but, well, actually it should. It's filling on both sides, but that's okay. That's all we need. And now, in there, we can add the vertical box I wanted to add. So first, we want this to be on the side, like this, stretching on the left wide. And from there, all we need to do is just to add elements. So we will use labels, right? So here there will be a resource. And now, when we add more resource, they will add sadly and definitely. So how do we deal with that? We can use this scroll view. Well, we can use the scroll view, right? Which is what I showed you earlier. So here we can use a scroll container, which will be left wide. And actually, well, I wanted to do that a little bit later, but I will do it now. Here we have this space, okay, before the resources begin to scroll. We need this little space here to display important informations. So again, we do have a vertical box. So we have a VBox container, which is anchored on the left wide. And in there we have two blocks. So we have the bottom block and the top block. So here we have the resources. And here we have ground information. I don't remember what was in there, but that's it. So this ground information, I actually want it to be 160 pixels, and the resources will take the rest of the space, like this. Okay, so now those ground informations, I can change the type to a VBox container. Can I give a minimum size? Yes, perfect. And in there, I will just add 3 labels, or 2, 3, doesn't matter. That will be, this is about the ground, and this will be another thing about the ground. Okay, so here, the little problem we have is we want that to stick at the bottom. We just go in the informations here, in the VBox container, and we have the opportunity to have the alignment at the end, right? Next, we have the resources here. So the resources, we will change the type to be a scroll container, like this. We will remove the horizontal scroll, and we want the vertical scroll to, well, it doesn't matter. It will just be automatic. Now that we have this, we can create a VBox container within the scroll view and add resources within there. So here we have a resource, and now as we duplicate those resources, we will have a scrolling view, right? So now if I start this, we do have a scroll view in there. Here we have the scroll to be completely on the right. This can probably be dealt with just by going in the layout, the container sizing, and to change the horizontal anchor to shrink at the beginning. So here, this box doesn't actually get wider based on the width of the next block, right? That can be useful. Right, next we can go with this little pound things at the top. So how this works is the pounds will accumulate at the middle of the screen, and at some point I actually never got that many pounds, but I guess you can just scroll, right? So it's going to be the exact same thing, but instead of being sticked to the top left, it will be at the center. Here in our main area, so that's gonna be left side, I'm actually gonna add a scroll view at the top, but I don't want the scroll to happen when the pounds reach the sides of the screen. I want to leave space on each side so that there's space. This comes in the form of a margin. So this margin, only thing I want to do in it is to have 160 pixels on the left and the right. Okay, and I want this margin to be top wide, like this. This is going to be the top side. And in there, as I said, we need to add a scroll container. Scroll container, which will be horizontally in the middle. Well, actually, no, wait, we need to, yes, it needs to fill. Right. But within that, we will have the horizontal box container, which now will be centered. Well, actually, we don't need to. No, sorry. We just need to add this HBox container, and we will just change the alignment to center. It will be better. In there, I will just add little squares like this, which will be 80 by 80. And those squares will represent the size of a pound. So the scroll container here, we need to set it up. So the vertical scroll is going to be disabled, and the horizontal scroll is going to be automatic. And now we do want those things to be at the center. But we need just to say that this pound list, it needs to expand horizontally, right? So that the position at the middle. So now we should be able to create pounds and have them come in a scroll at some points. Maybe we can actually increase slightly the separation so they aren't as squished. All right, that's decent. The only thing we didn't do is those buttons at the bottom plus those informations regarding the calendar and whatever, and then the stacking notifications. So we do need, just like the left side, we do need a vertical box on the right side, right? So in the main area, let's create a V box, which is going to be right side. The anchor right and wide seems to be fitting. And we're going to have a control node which represents the space for the notifications. So that's going to be notifications. Then I will create a space which is going to be a VBox, which I will name calendar. And another space which will be a horizontal box for the time buttons. So that will be time buttons. And last, the grid, a grid container, which will be the filter buttons. So here, notifications will be the one expanding, right? Meanwhile, the others will just take space based on what they need. Let's start with the calendar. It's actually an easy one. Here, I'm just going to create a few labels. So this is, let's say, date. And important because we're on the right side of the screen. We want the horizontal alignment to be right. So we have the date, then hour, and maybe season. That's going to be enough. Maybe let's add temperature. Now we need a time button. So here we will have a few little buttons. So we have one button like this. Again, I want those to be horizontally shrink to the end. Is that okay? Oh no, it's just the alignment end actually. But anyway, I will just create my 4 buttons like this. And now I just need to add the filter buttons. So here we have a grid. So when we work with container grids, we need to assign the amount of columns. So we have 5 columns in remote filters. And there we go. We will just create little panel buttons. I don't know, maybe 14, 20, 31. Okay, that's better. Right, so now we have our filter buttons right there. And we just have to add those notifications. So those are actually going to be organized in a VBox container. Notifications, they will again be aligned at the end because we want the notification to be from bottom to top. And right there, we will add labels. So this is a notification, which can be big. All right. The reason why I made a big notification is to just show you that the filters here, we need to change the layout somehow so that the buttons are sticked to the end, right? So now I can just duplicate those things. Why? Oh, I can duplicate those labels and we can now stack notifications on top of each others. And that's it, actually. We now have a user interface which is kind of like the one you would find in RimWorld. Let's see how this looks when we actually have it there. Let's just zoom this camera a little bit. 2.2, so that now I can get that game running, and there we go. We have the map, and we have the buttons, the resources. So obviously it looks not that good because the base theme of Godot is to have things being transparent. But here we don't want transparent things, but anyway, we have to deal with those. So yep, that's it. It's been an hour of recording. This is an example of how you can make user interface with an overlay type of user interface, but it's a little bit more complex, I guess, to make web-like user interfaces. Just to remind you, here we do have the interface of Magic Research. So in theory, I guess you should be able to reproduce this kind of things with all the containers we have. I didn't plan to do it right now, but if you want me to do it in another video, you can ask for it. I guess I can do that, how to reproduce a user interface like this. And yeah. So anyway, this is it for this video. I hope you like this interpretation of user interface in Godot, that you enjoyed how to theorize user interfaces and how to actually implement user interfaces. Let me know if you liked it. And yeah, that's it for me. I will see you in another video. I'm out and you take care.